Right, okay? So square root of a negative number, girls, does not exist. It doesn't exist. Does not exist. Okay, so maybe we will do notes. Error message. So this is complex numbers. This is because the square root of a negative number does not exist. Yeah. So the square root of a negative number is an imaginary number, right? Have red lights started flashing in your heads now? She's talking about imaginary numbers. I can't get my head around real numbers. Square root of a negative number is an imaginary number. Okay, so I'm talking about imaginary numbers. Okay, in this chapter, complex numbers is basically a real number and an imaginary number. So I'm telling you about imaginary numbers first. Okay, so the square root of a negative number is an imaginary number, and we let the square root of -1 equal to the letter I for imaginary. Okay, and this little statement here is what all this chapter is based on, right? That the square root of -1, we say, well, the square root of -1 doesn't exist, so we just say it's imaginary, right? So if you try and get the square root of -1, it'll give you an error message, because an I, right? Because your calculator doesn't do imaginary numbers, your calculator only does real numbers, okay? So that's why the calculator gives you an error message, because calculators don't deal with imaginary numbers, okay? Right, okay? So if I go back to the square root of -64, I can write this as the square root of +64 multiplied by the square root of -1, okay? So I can write the square root of -64 as the square root of +64 multiplied by the square root of -1, okay? Because 64 multiplied by -1 is -64, okay? Got it? We know what the square root of 64 is. What's the square root of 64? And what do we call, I just said, what do I call the square root of -1? I. So we write the square root of -64 as 8i. Right? Did I cut you off by doing this? Is everyone up with me? Yes. Yeah. Okay. So because you cannot get the square root of -64 because it doesn't exist, right? I'm going to make up I'm not going to make up a new branch of maths, but there's a branch of maths that deals with imaginary numbers. As in, the imaginary numbers, they don't exist, so we have to deal with it somehow, right? So the square root of -1, so whoever came up with this method of maths, they said, well, let's just say that the square root of -1, let's just call it I, right, for imaginary, I for imaginary. right? So the square root of minus 1, so everywhere I see the square root of minus 1 now, I'm just going to write I, right? Because I know square root of minus 1 does not exist, so I'm going to say it's I, right? So the square root of minus 64, right? Minus 64 is the same as 64 multiplied by minus 1. Would you agree? Right? So minus 64 is the same as the square, or 64 multiplied by minus 1. So that means the square root of minus 64 is equal to the square root of 64 multiplied by the square root of 1. Is that okay? Right, I just gave everything a square root sign. Right? But I know what the square root of 64 is. It's 8. And this whole branch of maths, every time I see the square root of minus 1, I stick in a 9. Okay, I'll do another one. If I had the square root of minus 4, right, let's just say I had minus 4 to start with. How could I write 4? Minus 4 is the same as 4 multiplied by minus 1, would you agree? Because 4 multiplied by minus 1 is what? Minus 4, isn't it? So let's give each one a square root sign. So the square root of minus 4 can be written as the square root of 4 multiplied by the square root of minus 1. So what's the square root of 4, please? 2. And this is the whole new branch of maths, so instead of the square root of minus 1, what do I call it? I. Another one. Square root of minus 16. How will I write it? That doesn't exist. I can't type it into calculator, get an error message. So how will I write it? Yeah, root 16 multiplied by root minus 1. Okay? I'm just using a dot for a multiply because I don't want to put a multiply sign in there because you'll think it's an x. What is the square root of 16? What number multiplied by itself will give you 16? 4. And how do I write the square root of minus 1? And that's what... Will you do for me there very quickly? Minus 100. Hello. Yeah, that's the only time you put in an I, when you end up with the square root of minus 1. So if there's no minus, like as in minus 4, there was no minus 1 there. So you have to write it so there is a minus 1. Okay? Square root of 100. Right? Do we all write it as the square root of 100 multiplied by the square root of minus 1? Square root of 100 is what? 10. And square root of minus 1 is written as? I. So instead of square root of minus 100, we write 10i. Okay? Right? So they are imaginary numbers. Okay? How do you know they're imaginary numbers? So 10i is an imaginary number. How do you know it's an imaginary number? Because it's got that I in there. I for imaginary. Okay? So what a complex number is, and it's what this whole chapter is based on. So a complex number So a number such as 2 plus 3i is a complex number. In English, what complex means? If I said something was very complex, what would it be? Yes, difficult. It's complicated, isn't it? Okay? So a complex number is, it's a bit complicated. Okay? Is a complex number. 8 is made up of 2 parts, girls. A real part, and what do you think the other part is? An imaginary part, yeah. So a complex number, it's made up of 2 parts. It's made up of a real part and it's made up of an imaginary part. So the real part is, you tell me, 2 plus 3i, which is the real part? Which part? 2, yeah. And what is the imaginary part? 3i. And how do you know the imaginary part? Because it's got the letter what? I for imaginary. Okay? Okay, see. So then if I had something like 3 plus the square root of minus 9, right, if I had something like that, okay, the minus 9, I use that to turn it into what I had a minute ago. So minus 9, how would I write the square root of minus 9? How would I write that? As the square root of 9 multiplied by the square root of minus 1. So square root of 9 is what? 3. The square root of minus 1 is written as I. So for this number, instead of saying 3 plus the square root of minus 9, I would call that 3 plus 3i.
So did you completely forget about the real number?
No, it's still there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's still there. So I have to write a real part. So the real number is here and the imaginary bit is there.
Oh, okay.
So the whole number is 3 plus 3i. There's a real bit and an imaginary bit.
Yeah.
So I don't have to do anything with the real bit. Okay? I just have to rewrite minus 9. Is that okay? Right. I think I'm going to leave it at there for today. Right. And on page 94, there's a couple of very short questions to do. So I want you to do page 94, 1 to 3. They're up at the top of the page. Okay? So page 94, 1 to 3, they're up at the top of the page.